Hey, nice to see everybody in the audience. Hopefully we'll have a few more people trickle in person, but we also have a Zoom audience tonight. So welcome to everybody on Zoom. My name is Mark Barnico. I'm the Executive Director of the University of Chicago campus here in Hong Kong. And tonight I'm excited to hear our talk, Resolving the Child Care Paradox. As always, we're sharing this program tonight on Zoom and Facebook and YouTube. For those of you that are on YouTube or Facebook, you can log into Zoom if you want to ask a question by clicking on the Q&A button, as you know. We're happy to have Professor Julia Henly with us tonight. She is the Samuel Deutsch Professor of the Crown Family School of Social Work, Policy, and Practice at the University of Chicago. She also serves as a Deputy Dean for Research at the Crown School and Faculty Development. She's a co-director of the Employment, Instability, Family Wellbeing, and Social Policy Network. And she's also been a fellow in several places, the Society for Social Work and Research, Interdisciplinary Research Leadership Program Fellow of the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, and the 2016 Distinguished Fellow of the William T. Grant Foundation. She's a longstanding member of the steering committee of the USDHHS Administration for Children and Families, Childcare, and Early Education Policy Research Consortium. She has her bachelor's degree in psychology and social work from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and her MSW and PhD in social work and social psychology from the University of Michigan. I'd like to turn the stage over to Professor Henly for her talk tonight.
Can you hear me? Okay, great. So thanks a lot to Mark for inviting me this evening to give this talk, and for Shannon and Sandy and everyone else who made the logistics possible. I'm going to talk about some work I do in the childcare space today. The title of my talk is Resolving the Childcare Paradox, Policy Levers to Support Parental Employment, Children's Development, and the Childcare Workforce. As I'll talk about, it's sometimes very difficult to kind of work between these three constituents when we're thinking about childcare and early education policy. So let me get started. First of all, childcare is a critical work support for parents. Most mothers of young children work in the United States. Work is an expectation of parents in the United States. Over 2/3 of moms are in the labor market. Disproportionately, that number's higher for low-income mothers. And when moms are working, and dads, but dads historically have worked, mothers have been more likely to stay home, but when mothers enter the labor market, over 3/4 of kids under 5 are in some kind of non-parental care when their parents are working. This is a major expense and a logistical challenge for parents much of the time, as I'll talk about in my talk today. While a necessary work support for parents, childcare is also an important developmental support for kids with high returns on investment to high quality care. Yet quality varies widely in the childcare market in the United States, with studies suggesting that most kids are in mediocre to poor quality care in the US. What kinds of care do kids find themselves in? Centers and early childhood education spaces, which are more institutional care, licensed family childcare homes, and also most kids actually spend time when they're not with their parents in informal family, friend, and neighbor care. In addition, non-standard or childcare in the United States is more or less available to certain groups of families and groups of kids. And we see that infants and toddlers, rural families, and families who have kids with special caregiving needs are especially underserved in the childcare market. The challenges with finding care extend to the childcare industry. So the US's primarily private childcare industry is an important economic sector, but it's really quite fragile. For childcare providers, the problem is one of low pay, high turnover, and really difficult working conditions. But in addition, the childcare industry is a very low profit industry, and providers and programs really have a difficult time making ends meet and staying in business. So what I'd like to do is say a little bit about this, situation of care for parents, for children, and for the providers that offer care. So we have this real, what I would say, policy conundrum or policy paradox in the United States. How do we build an affordable, high-quality system of care that serves as a work support to parents, as a developmental investment in children, and also as a high-quality, stable employment space for providers? And that's really what I want to try to think about with you today. So first of all, what makes it so difficult? Well, parents need childcare that aligns with their family budgets and also with their work schedules. At the same time, the labor market in the United States over the last 40 years has been characterized by deterioration in job quality, which makes it really difficult for parents to find childcare that aligns with their work. In particular, I'm going to just illustrate this point by focusing on three aspects of the labor market: wages and compensation, what I call precarious work schedules, and also non-standard work hours. So in terms of wages and compensation, this graph has become kind of an iconic graph in labor economics in the last many years. So what we see in the United States, the x-axis is time, and that vertical line is 1980. We see that productivity and wages really tracked together till about 1979. And then we see this real split where productivity kept increasing, but wages no longer were tracking with economic growth. In other words, as companies became more profitable, they were less likely to be sharing those profits with their workers. And we see that hourly compensation at the bottom of the labor market, with this is all workers, but if I were to show you just hourly compensation at the bottom of the labor market, at the bottom quartile of the labor market, you would see that wages over the last 40 years have been stable, stagnant, and even declining up until the last 4 years, where we actually do see low-wage workers seeing gains for the first time in many years, in many decades. In addition to wages and compensation, we see that increasingly work schedules are becoming very precarious. So this is a point in time. We actually don't have great data over time, but the data we do have suggests that work has become increasingly precarious in the US labor market, especially at the low end of the labor market. This is 2016 data, and it's national data. And what I've done here is broken down the dark blue line is low-paid hourly workers. So workers are either paid by the hour or by salary. I'm looking at hourly workers in the bottom 1/3 of the labor market, and then I'm looking at salaried workers in the top 1/3, just to show you the difference in precarity of work schedules for these two groups. And let me just take you through these four data points. So first of all, hours have become increasingly volatile. So I shouldn't say increasingly when I show you this graph, because this is a point in time, but let me say work schedules are quite volatile. So hours fluctuate quite a bit from day to week, hour to hour, or season to season in jobs in the United States. And you can see this is true actually for hourly as well as salaried workers in the US. 80% of low-wage hourly workers, as well as 82% of higher-paid salaries workers, see some fluctuations in their hours. Maybe that's not so surprising. People don't work exactly the same number of hours each week. But what we see with this data that's not shown here is that 30% of those hour fluctuations are more than 8 hours up or 8 hours down in a week. That's a whole day of work. And we see that low-wage workers are much more likely to see their hours fluctuate down, and higher income workers are much more likely to see their hours fluctuate up. In addition to hour fluctuations, we see unpredictability in jobs today. So low-wage hourly workers, over 50% of them don't know their work schedule with more than 1 week advance notice. Think about that you have to go to work next week and you're not sure whether you're going to work Monday, Wednesday, Friday, Tuesday, Thursday, in the evening, in the weekend, et cetera. Even salaried workers in the United States, almost a third of them get less than 1 week notice of their work schedule. And then finally, the last two data points I want to talk about when I talk about precarity in the labor market is workers increasingly have limited input in the timing of their work and also the number of hours that they work. And this is especially true for low-paid hourly workers. So almost 2/3 of low-paid hourly workers say that their employer entirely controls the times in which they work. And over half of them say that their employer entirely controls the number of hours they work each week. Those numbers are lower for higher paid salaried workers. So in addition to low wages and work schedule precarity, work schedules are often take place in a 24/7 economy. So 1/3 of children 5 years or under have parents that are working during non-traditional hours. Of those kids, about half of them have parents that work on weekends, 43% early mornings, 36% evenings, and about 18% overnight. While on the overall prevalence of non-traditional hour work has not changed in the last 30 years, the distribution of those non-traditional hours has changed so that low-income workers are disproportionately working non-traditional hours today compared to in previous times. And low-income single-parent mothers work approximately 1/4 of all of their hours are during non-traditional times, so evenings, weekends, overnight. Okay, so that kind of really quick and dirty run through the labor market changes in the last 40 years is meant to say that parents of young kids are disproportionately have limited earnings to pay for childcare, and they're working at all sorts of times and in unpredictable, volatile schedules. The childcare market in the United States simply does not align with these changing labor market demands. So most formal childcare programs provide care during standard daytime hours. This is a slide from a 2012 national data set that shows the light blue bar at the very top are childcare centers, and then we have licensed family childcare homes, and then we have paid unlicensed family childcare homes and unpaid unlicensed family childcare homes. And the basic trend, as you can see, is that the most formal center care, the care that we often think of is kind of the early enriching childcare, is least likely to be offered during non-standard hours. This doesn't mean, I should say, that parents who work non-traditional hours don't use that daytime, possibly higher quality care, but they're not able to use it, apparently, to take care of their children during work hours. Okay, so to try to make this point a little more clearly, not from the supply side, but the demand side, together with my graduate students, we conducted a study in 2019 of a nationally representative sample of low-income parents who work non-traditional hours. And we're asking in this, I'm going to show you some graphs in a minute, we're asking in this set of graphs, where are children when their parents are working non-traditional hours? So it's a slightly different question than looking at the supply of childcare that I just showed you. We're saying from the parent perspective, where are kids when they're working non-traditional hours? So I'm going to show you the availability and the use of different kinds of non-parental care by family structure and by people's work schedules. What we find is that 2/5 of low-income families who work non-traditional hours use non-parental childcare during those hours. That's the dark blue bar. 56% report that they don't use any childcare during those hours. So kids are presumably home alone or being cared for by a second parent. About 15% of the full sample relies on some kind of paid non-traditional hour care. And single parents in the sample are most likely to use some kind of paid care. Parents with more predictable schedules are more likely to be able to use paid childcare. And of that group who use some kind of non-traditional hour care, single parents are much more likely have a much greater odds of using non-traditional hour care, as do and extended households. People that live with relatives, with, for example, with their grandmother or grandfather, are less likely to use any non-traditional hour care. But of those people who use non-traditional hour care of some sort, 48% of them in this sample report that they use unpaid family child care. This is care from relatives, friends, neighbors, et cetera. Of those that use centers, 17%, only almost all of that care, very little of that care, is center-based care that's outside of early morning time. So in the US market, what we know both from this study and from other studies is that centers disproportionately offer care during standard daytime hours. And when they diverge from that, they extend up into early morning, but they almost never provide care after 5:30 p.m. in the United States. Occasionally, they might provide care till 7 p.m. And there are a few 24/7 centers, but very few. And single parents in this representative sample are more likely to rely on center care. And they use center care typically to kind of cap above a daytime work schedule. So they don't have, for example, a grandmother or an uncle who can watch their child in early morning. And so they bring their child to the center early and then they stay for the full day. Okay. So in addition to the childcare market not aligning particularly well with parents' work schedules, the childcare market also doesn't align with family budgets. I mentioned that wages have deteriorated over the last 40 decades, and childcare is just extremely expensive. For parents, parents who spend any money on childcare spend anywhere from $6,000 to $20,000 on average for one child per year. The reason why that is such a huge range is because childcare prices in the United States vary greatly by geography, as well as by the type of care. So I talked about center care, center care, family child care, both licensed and unlicensed. And as you might expect, center care is the most expensive kind of care, and home-based unlicensed care is the least expensive kind of care when it's paid care. But it's also more expensive to find care for an infant or toddler, or to find care for a child with special needs. So that's why we see this big range in costs. This is a significant expense for families. So low-income parents in particular who pay for childcare spend on average 30% of their household budget, their household income, on childcare expenses. That's the same as it costs for a 4-year public university in the United States. The childcare market also is expensive for providers. It turns out that private tuition payments are insufficient to provide high-quality care to adequately compensate the workforce. So the true cost of operating what we would hope might be a high-quality childcare center that pays its workforce with reasonable wages is much higher than what the private market can bear. You can see that there's this sort of gap. And so what that means is that providers are disincentivized, right, to invest in high quality care. They have to sort of make do with the private tuition for the most part that they get. So this, I would argue, is kind of a classic need for public investment. Childcare doesn't really work as an entirely private sector good. And so we have this situation where the price of childcare is too high for many families to afford, but it's too low for providers to cover costs, to provide decent jobs for their workforce, and to also invest in high quality care. These conditions, I argue, create inequities in access for families, and they make it difficult for providers to extend their care to harder to serve families or to invest in the professional development and wages of their staff. Okay, so up until now, I wanted to sort of like keep you take you with me to say that we do need some kind of public investment in childcare. That may not be something that's a hard thing to sell to this group, but it sometimes is in the United States. But if you believe me that this is a case to be made for public investment, the question is, what should those public investments look like? how do we invest in childcare that serves the needs of working parents, of children, and of also the childcare workforce? Should we invest directly in the formal sector, that is, help centers and licensed family childcare homes better accommodate the family budgets and the work schedules of families? Should we invest in the informal sector that's already doing much of the work and try to make it easier and more supportive for them? Or should we subsidize parents directly, allowing them to choose the kind of care that makes the most sense for their circumstances? So I'm going to switch gears a little bit, and talk about these different kinds of investments that we think about in the United States for public investment in childcare. To do that, let me sort of introduce kind of two broad approaches to providing care, to funding care in the United States. We have a kind of classic demand side approach to care where we provide vouchers or subsidies to families so that they can purchase care in the private market. And then we also have a supply side approach where we invest directly in programs, for example, providing contracts or grants to centers or homes so that they can provide care for children that they serve, but bypassing families directly. So we could give families vouchers and have them purchase care in the private market, or we could take government funds and invest it in programs directly. In the United States, the vast majority of federal dollars go to this demand side voucher approach. And I'm going to spend a fair amount of time thinking with you about that approach. Recently, there has been more interest in a supply side approach in the United States, and I'll say a little bit about that. And then I want to think about, for the remainder of the talk, really how these two kind of broad approaches align with the needs of families, the needs of parents, the needs of kids, and the needs of providers. Okay, so let's think about this demand side approach. And here I want to first back up and think about what is the theory of change? Why do we think a demand side approach might work? And so let me just read this out loud. So this is kind of how we think about a voucher demand side approach. By providing vouchers or subsidies to parents, we make private market care more affordable, enabling families to purchase higher quality care for their children. Vouchers also give parents, theoretically at least, choice to select the kind of care that best meets their needs, whether centers, family childcare homes, or informal providers. In turn, vouchers become revenue for providers, which providers could, it doesn't mean they necessarily do, but could invest in their workforce to improve quality, job quality, or to invest in their programs directly to improve the developmental appropriateness of the care. Okay, so this is, of course, a theory of change. Research suggests somewhat mixed evidence for the relationships hypothesized in a demand-side approach, and I'll talk about some of these, the empirical data on this in the context of our primary childcare program in the United States, which comes from the Childcare Development Block Grant. CCDBG, the Childcare Development Block Grant, is our primary federal means-tested childcare subsidy program in the United States. It really came about during the late 1980s and became the centerpiece of the 1996 welfare reform law in the United States. It is very much a product of that welfare reform law. Welfare reform in the 1990s was all about getting low-income families into the labor market. And the Child Care Development Block Grant was exactly designed to help families do that. So it's meant to be a work support. It's conditioned on employment, so you don't get to use the program unless you're working. And you can only use your voucher to support childcare during working hours, or in some cases when you're in school. The key objectives of the Child Care Subsidy Program in the United States, the Child Care Development Block Grant Program, the primary objective is really to promote employment and financial independence in line with those goals of welfare reform. But when the program was reauthorized in 2014, there was more attention to this second objective, to improve the care quality for kids, which was kind of left out of the original welfare reform version of the child care program. And in the most recent reform of the program in 2024, there was a lot more attention to the role of the child care subsidy program, the role of the child care subsidy dollars to actually support the child care industry itself. That comes out of the pandemic era challenges of the childcare industry. There was a lot of attention to kind of saving the childcare industry from collapse when you have a private sector industry and parents are pulling their kids out of care. There was a lot of concern that the industry would fall into itself, and there was a lot of attention to using the childcare subsidy program to really protect the childcare industry. But nevertheless, despite these three objectives, I would still say that the Childcare Development Block Grant is primarily a work support objective. It's really to get parents into the labor market, and there's relatively less attention to the other two objectives. And as a result, it's a demand-side voucher system that provides, 80% or more of childcare subsidy dollars are delivered in the form of vouchers for parents who can then try to find care in the private sector. It serves about 1.3 million people. This is down from about 1.8 million people in its heyday. That's not because the funding has been reduced. It's because more and more parents are being encouraged to use the voucher for center-based care, something I'll return to later, and center-based care is more expensive. And so when you have a relatively fixed budget, there's less money to go around and there are fewer people served. There's a lot of state discretion. We have 50 states in the United States. There's a lot of state discretion in how states structure their program. Eligibility criteria vary. And as you'll see, not all states, even though the voucher system is a choice program, not all states allow all kinds of care, legal care to be used. Some states really really require parents to use the voucher for licensed family childcare homes and centers and not the informal market. That varies quite a bit. So what do we know about how well childcare subsidies meet the needs of working parents, of children, and of providers? So really quickly, vouchers are an important work family support for families, and they increase access to affordable childcare. So I'm going to say a lot of negative things about how well the childcare subsidy program works or doesn't work, but I do want to make clear that when you have access to a subsidy, childcare is more affordable, and if you talk to parents, they almost always say they would have a hard time surviving without it. We also see that there's pretty good evidence. Most of this is non-experimental, but it's multivariate, carefully done correlational work that suggests that receipt of childcare subsidy is related to more hours of work, to fewer work disruptions, and to greater likelihood of employment. So it sort of seems to have positive outcomes to meet its goal of childcare as a work support, at least as measured in those ways. It also makes childcare more affordable, and so we see and we see, partly because of design, we see an increased use of childcare centers as a result of subsidies. I should say those are childcare centers that are primarily, as you saw, during daytime hours. So despite those kind of positive findings about the subsidy program, there's reason for concern. Subsidies are not an entitlement, and they only cover a fraction of eligible families. About 20% of all eligible families in the United States receive a child care subsidy. And there's also a lot of inequities in who receives a subsidy. So infants and toddlers, rural families, kids with special needs, and kids whose parents work non-traditional hours are least likely to be covered by the subsidy program. And in fact, only 6% of vouchers go to serve informal childcare, even though that's where most families have their children. Subsidy spells, so time on subsidy is relatively short and unstable. So this is actually where a lot of my work has been historically, so that people get on the subsidy program, that 20% that gets on it, but they don't stay on it very long. And research suggests that even when people leave the subsidy, they're still often eligible, but because of administrative burden and hassle with the program, a lot of people cycle on and off it, which if you've studied welfare programs in the United States, this is a common feature of welfare programs in the United States. There's a lot of churn. Partly due to administrative burden. And then there's mixed evidence for whether or not subsidies increase access to quality care. So while we know that people who use subsidies are more likely to use centers, and on average, centers are more likely to be higher quality, at least as quality measures are typically done, higher quality than licensed family childcare homes or informal care. Nevertheless, the kind of center care that subsidies purchase tend to be lower quality centers. So we don't see the boost necessarily, or there's mixed evidence about whether we see the boost of quality for center-based subsidized care. There's really mixed findings there. In addition, and this is important, childcare subsidies, as I said, reimburse providers well below the private market rate for childcare. And so this is a slide you saw, the figure you saw before, and this is especially concerning, I would say, that subsidies cover really below market rate, because we know that the market rate for care is already below what it would cost to deliver high quality care that is the kind of developmentally appropriate care that we might want for children. So childcare subsidy reimbursements really aren't up to the task of subsidizing high quality care. So this suggests then that vouchers alone may not be enough. As a primary policy tool, demand-side subsidies are unlikely, I would say, to address all three of these objectives. It would require a massive increase in subsidy budgets to increase take-up for all eligible families. Remember, we're at 20% now. It would take a lot to get anywhere near 100%. And then we also would want to theoretically expand coverage to people that aren't eligible, but are still having family budgets that aren't amenable to purchase private care of high quality. And we need to increase provider reimbursement rates very high to sufficiently incentivize providers to reimburse for the true cost of care, which Illinois estimates to be 7 times the cost of what the subsidy typically covers. But even then, even if we did all of that and increased, we increased the subsidy budget, demand-side subsidies alone would not by themselves necessarily compel providers to invest in program quality or invest in job quality or to care for underserved populations like infants and toddlers or non-traditional hour workers, where I started today. Because vouchers help parents afford care, but they don't dictate how providers carry out that care. So providers may take in more revenue, but the demand-side approach doesn't tell providers how they should use that revenue. So that suggests that a supply-side approach may actually be another way to think about those other two objectives of childcare, that is to improve quality and to improve the quality of the childcare workforce, the jobs of the childcare workforce. So the theory of change underlying a supply-side approach goes something like this. Revenue needs to be both sufficient and predictable for childcare programs to maintain stable, well-paid staff and to deliver quality programming to kids with diverse educational and care needs. By providing supply-side grants directly to childcare programs and making funding conditional on quality and staffing investments, a supply-side approach is expected to demonstrate program quality improvements as well as workforce gains, and by extension, increase access then to quality, affordable care for families. So that's kind of the theory of change from a supply-side approach. Again, that doesn't mean empirically it does that. And so supply-side approaches then seem to offer some advantages for trying to reconcile this childcare paradox. Supply-side approaches do offer more predictable, stable revenue for programs because programs get revenue up front. They don't have to deal with private families who may or may not be regular payers of their tuition, and they don't have to deal with the underfunding and the instability of the subsidy system. In addition, funding can be made conditional then on specific policy objectives. So states can say, you can have this grant, but only if you pay your workers more, or you can have this grant, but only if you invest in quality. Or they could even say, you can have this grant, but only if you provide care during non-traditional hours. So there's something that states are excited about with a kind of supply-side approach because it's an investment that they might have more control over when they're investing in care as opposed to the voucher approach. Illinois has been funding and experimenting with the supply side. We still have, Illinois is the state I come from, we still have disproportionate share of our childcare subsidy budget goes to vouchers, but the state has put significant dollars in the last few years into the supply side, what's called Smart Start Childcare Initiative. I have a grant to evaluate with some colleagues to evaluate these initiatives. But the idea behind this is, in the case of Illinois, we're conditioning Smart Start supply side investments on requirements that programs pay their workers more and participate in quality investments. And we're going to be evaluating over the next 4 years how well these initiatives work. The challenges, however, just in thinking about supply side approaches, is that compared to vouchers, supply side investments don't necessarily align with what parents need. So they do focus on the kids and the workforce, but they don't necessarily focus on the work support side of, like vouchers do. So to date, most US supply side approaches, including the one that I'm evaluating in Illinois, has targeted centers, and in the case of Illinois, also licensed family childcare homes, but has kept non-traditional informal providers out of contention for these grants. So seldom have states used supply side investments to either increase the flexibility of formal providers so that they better accommodate the non-traditional hour needs of families, nor have these supply side investments really invested in the informal side, as I suggested. So I think there's a real risk as states start to move toward these supply side investments that they could entirely bypass this really large share of low-income families who are working in kind of this 24/7 economy and really do need care for their kids during non-traditional hours. So while I think there's lots of benefits to supply side approaches, I don't know that they properly work across these 3 objectives. So let me, in closing then, return to this policy conundrum that I started with. How do we build an affordable, high-quality system of care that serves as a work support to parents, a tool of child development for kids, and that high-quality, stable employment for providers? So first of all, I think addressing this policy challenge is going to require major public investment, both on the demand and the supply side. It's not an either-or thing. I think vouchers are an important policy tool, but I think at least as it currently stands, they're insufficient to meet families' needs and to raise program quality or adequately compensate providers. But absolutely increasing voucher value, in other words, the reimbursement rates, would surely help this conundrum, but not solve it. Supply side investments, on the other hand, can directly target care quality and workforce compensation. Public preschool is a really good example, and if we have time in the Q&A, I could talk about that. But they really may not serve as a work support for many families because most public preschool and other centers just don't align with the work needs of families. So we might want to think about experimenting with incentivizing the formal sector to be more flexible around parents' longer hours and also non-traditional hours. And the informal sector has been mostly left out of most childcare policy discussions, other than efforts to formalize it, basically to move kids out of the informal sector into formal care. And I think that may really be a mistake because the vast majority of low-income families have their children in informal care. And to the extent that we don't think about that sector, we're kind of missing the main work support tool for families who are in the labor market. I think it might make sense to experiment with increasing investments in the informal sector through supply-side grants, through wage subsidies for informal providers, and through training programs. In final conclusion, I also think, and this goes outside of what I've been talking about for the last 45 minutes, I think we really can't expect the childcare providers or childcare policy to solve the problems of what is really a labor market issue. And so childcare policy, even if it were really good policy that was as tuned as we could make it to working across the work support, child development, and workforce objectives that we want it to be, on its own, it's really going to be insufficient to respond to the many work-family challenges that face low-income families. I think for that, and this would be the subject of a different talk, I think we really need to think about reforming the labor market itself that low-income families find themselves in, perhaps through questions about minimum wage policy, right to request schedules, fair work week policies, minimum hour policies. These are all kind of labor reforms that have been discussed, but certainly nowhere near passage in the United States. We also, in the United States, do not have a paid family leave policy or a paid parental leave policy. Some people get that through their employer, but we don't have any federal paid leave policy. And we don't have family allowances or child allowances. And although we do have a child tax credit, it mostly goes to middle-class families, and most low-income families do not receive any kind of child tax credit policies. So I think we can expect even the best childcare policy to really resolve this paradox, because a lot of it is really housed in the labor market. And ultimately, and this will be my final point, I think really, we need some sort of cultural shift toward valuing both formal and informal care labor in order to really move kind of to the next level. And that will be a longer term project, at least in the United States, to get there. So I will stop there. Thank you. So I'm happy to take questions or.
Questions in the audience first?
Okay, I have a question. Is there a role that the social sector would play in this scenario? Say for Hong Kong, a lot of the NGOs, they do provide quality childcare service as additional to the core business. For example, if they take care of well-being of youth or children, they also set up side programs, for example, to support working parents who cannot take care of their children during work hour or shortly after work hours. So what is the role of the social sector in US doing?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a huge role for the social sector, and at least in the United States, it's often operates through government programs. So an NGO will get a government grant to supplement some philanthropy, and or there'll be a government grant that's really contracted out to the social sector to deliver. So I think in that way, this sort of demand side, supply side approach is absolutely compatible with a social sector approach. So either a demand side voucher could be used, right, to purchase care through an NGO or a social sector, or the government could invest directly in social sector programs to improve the quality of care. I think a second part of your question might be, can we do this without government funds? In the United States, I think it's pretty clear that philanthropy plays a huge role in childcare as well as other social safety net programs, but it's a huge role, but it's not anywhere near the amount of care that the federal government, the amount of funding that federal government puts into childcare. So can we do that? Absolutely, yes. Is there enough money in the kind of philanthropic sector to do the kind of investment that I'm arguing we would need to do to really lift up that, you know, to go from 20% to 100% of subsidy? I don't think that in the United States, at least, the philanthropic sector is big enough to really do that. But absolutely, I think the running of programs in the United States as well is almost always either private for profit or private nonprofit social sector. I just think the money needs to come from somewhere else as well as from philanthropy. But yeah.
What do you think about the possibility of formalizing the informal care system, if you will? So sort of almost like giving a 401k to grandmother or for caring for a family member and whatnot. What's the thinking around that?
I think that I moved this up because I do think that there's interesting ways to think about basic social welfare programs that can serve the needs of extended households and extended families more than they do. So I think there's two ways this can go. If we really had in the United States a generous family allowance, so cash grants to parents when they have kids. In some states, in Scandinavian countries for sure, some of those family allowances go to, I mean, families make choices to pay for extended households to provide extended household members to provide that kind of care. So that's one place. But a second place is right here. So I think we really can think about, as you said, formalizing the informal sector. I think there's two things I want to say, one caution and, well, both are, I think, cautions. One is that there have been experiments in the United States to formalize the informal sector, and it usually comes in the form of you have to get training in order to be eligible to be a provider. And what we've seen in the United States when that has happened is big drops in subsidized informal caregivers. The reason why that concerns me is, so we did a study in Illinois that showed when training requirements were put in place, the number of informal providers on subsidy just went, like, it was just way down. The slope just went way down. And that really concerns me because from our work, we saw that those providers were still providing care. They just were no longer getting the financial benefit. And so two things there. One is they're providing care with fewer resources. And so you might worry that that care that you were concerned about wasn't as high quality before is possibly even lower quality. And to the extent that unregulated providers are on the subsidy program, they're at least a little above board and have a little more contact with the social safety net and this and government and programs. If they're completely outside, if they're completely underground, we really have no way of knowing what's happening to kids in those cares. So I think I like the idea of providing training and making that care higher quality. I think we haven't figured out a way to do it that doesn't scare the informal sector away. And it partly, I think, has to do with kind of the carrots or sticks that are used to encourage support. There are programs in the United States, small local programs that use more of a carrot approach, I would say, and that encourage, for example, informal providers to go to library learning sessions and things like that. It's not mandated, but it's part of sort of community supports. And those programs actually have pretty, and to be honest, they're not super well evaluated, but they seem to have pretty positive results. But when we've mandated training and mandating some kind of more formalizing or licensing of the informal sector, it hasn't worked very well in the United States. But I do think, you know, South Korea now is providing cash grants, I understand, I just learned this last week, to grandmothers who are providing care. Personally, I would rather not have that be targeted toward a particular kind of relationship, but I think that's basically a voucher that's available to informal care. That's the same as our demand side voucher and just allowing informal providers to have access to it. And I do think that that makes sense, even though I admit that we are not able to control quality in those settings. I think that's right. But I guess I'm just too practical, too pragmatic to think those folks are going to be providing care anyways. And so why don't we perhaps like recognize that and try to offer some financial assistance? Yeah.
So the US isn't exactly the gold standard of social policy interventions. I'm wondering whether there's a place out there where things overall work better and what you think the underlying reasons are for why childcare works better for families.
Absolutely, I would agree with that comment. I think that this is a sort of a bigger question and maybe a slightly different talk, but I think that what we know both on the labor market side and also on the childcare side, that Scandinavian countries, for example, have, although there's variation across them, but have much stronger kind of labor policies to begin with. So there's less precarity in the labor market to begin with. And they also have much stronger family policy set of family policies. So child allowances, they have a package of policies. So in addition to non-parental care, they also have paid family leave. They also have family allowances. And then they have labor market policy that make poverty rates much lower, et cetera. So I think it's that package of kind of employment, regulation, family supports, and non-parental childcare support that together, I think we have, and there is empirical evidence to suggest that if your dependent variable is work-family balance or reduced work-family conflict, we do see a correlation there. We also know that there are countries like Germany that historically have not invested in non-parental childcare very much at all, but have invested very heavily in family supports. So in other words, Germany's changing as I understand it, but historically, Germany had actually really generous family leave policies, but almost no investment in childcare as a work support. And what you see in that package of childcare arrangements, which you may value positively or negatively, but you see women just leave the labor market and they stay home and take care of their kids because there's not a non-parental childcare market for them. So the Scandinavian and France as well, that kind of model is a model that might work best. It's also a very expensive model. And I'm just now learning about what's happening in East Asia, so I can't speak in any way intelligently about country differences in this part of the world. But I gather that Korea, well, partly motivated by trying to get fertility up, a lot of East Asian countries have been experimenting with investments in a whole range of family policies as well as non-parental care policies. And I can't answer intelligently about whether those policies are working and what working means. Depends on the different variable. Yeah.
Thank you for sharing. Just want to wonder, in the US, is there any room for work-based childcare, like from the corporate?
Yeah.
Another thing is whether or not there are school-based childcare. Yep. I don't know whether you came a bit late, not sure if you covered those.
Yeah, so on the school-based childcare, there's quite a bit of public preschool and also after-school care. And I should say that I'm not suggesting that we shouldn't have heavy investments in public preschool and also before and after school care and also full-day center care. I think we should. I think those are important human capital investments for children so that they can be ready for school and do. My point is more that we shouldn't pretend that those are work supports for low-income families because they're often not. They often don't meet the needs of low-income parents as a work support. They might serve the child development goal, but not the work support goal. That's really my point. But we do have those programs, and they are, I would consider them supply-side investments, and they're more invested in the United States than demand-side approaches. We don't spend as much government dollars on them, but we do spend government money on those kinds of programs. And increasingly, states are investing in public preschool programs in particular with very good outcomes when they're measured by school readiness for children, not parent support. Corporate is a much trickier answer. We do have some businesses that provide different kinds of childcare subsidies to families. If what you're thinking about is on-site childcare, my read of that literature is that for some kinds of firms, on-site childcare can work, but usually it doesn't work. And the place it works best is in hospitals. So hospitals have a 24/7 workforce. They hire a lot of women of childbearing age, and in that kind of setting, and they have a lot of employees, and so the business model can work if you have enough employees of the right. But in a labor market that's very distributed, where there's lots of small service, like McDonald's and Burger Kings and small retail shops, it's very hard to think about what an on-site childcare program would look like. There are some models that kind of pool resources for community childcare that employers pay into. I think that's an interesting model. in the US, we have experiments like that, but we don't have any large scale effort that I know about.
We have some online questions. The first is, how hard is it to affect childcare policy? And do you think it's possible? And who are some of the stakeholders that need to be moved in order to impact that and make that happen?
So childcare is historically a bipartisan issue, so you would think it wouldn't be hard to move. It's actually, when we've had success in childcare legislatively, it's always been a kind of bipartisan issue. I think, and it's potentially about children. I think I actually have a doctoral student right now who's looking at whether public opinion for investment in childcare is different when you frame it as a work support for low-income mothers or low-income parents, or a kind of tool of child development for kids. And her hypothesis is that people will be more friendly toward it if it's saving children rather than helping parents. We don't have data on that yet, but even so a lot of times people say that, oh, policies that are about kids are much more positive and more supported in the United States. And it's true that opinion tends to support policies towards kids. But if you look at how much money the US spends on child-based policy compared to other countries, we're really not very friendly toward children in the United States, meaning that our policies, especially towards low-income children, are pretty thin. So I think it's hard to move on childcare policy. However, I think we have moved. I have a slide on childcare funding, which I didn't show you, and it was pretty flat. Well, it went way up with the welfare reform because it was sort of part of what welfare reform was, and then it was pretty flat for 20 years. And then we saw, actually in the first Trump administration, we saw one of the largest increases in childcare subsidy dollars, and it has stayed pretty much the same, except for with the pandemic stimulus dollars, it went way up again. So I think we have seen movement. I think it's hard to move. Who are the stakeholders and who are the people pushing? We have a pretty strong early education lobby at a state level and at a federal level. I think one of the challenges is this three objectives. Not everyone plays well together. And so people advocating for child development are not always the same people that are advocating for workers' rights, and are not always the same people that are advocating for low-income parents. And so I think they're sometimes working at cross purposes. But there is there's a very large kind of advocacy lobby for early care and education, and also for less so, but some for low-income parents in the United States.
Somebody did ask a question online about the amount of investment, which you just referred to. Do you have a number of how much is actually being invested? So
we had childcare spending on the Childcare Development Block Grant was pretty stable at $5 billion federally, US dollars federally, from the early 2000s. It went way up between 96 and 2001, and then it was really flat. There was a little blip. Went up to $8 billion during the 2008 recession because of stimulus dollars, and then the stimulus dollars were taken away, and it went right back down to $5 billion. And then starting in 2018, it went up to I think we were at $9 billion, and then we saw this unprecedented pandemic era investments that were just like tripling the budget. And so we saw this huge increase during the pandemic. Most of that money is no longer in, we're sort of back around $9 billion, I think. But that's not really right, because that's federal dollars, and states vary a lot in how much they contribute as well. So it's nowhere near what we would need in order to, that 20% up to something close to full subsidization. But we have seen increases over time. The problem is as I suggested, fewer families are actually being served because the subsidy dollars are going to pay for more expensive care, and so fewer people are being served even with the increase.
Maybe the last question, since you referred to differences in states' budgets and their approaches, who's leading in the U.S. from the standpoint of a state?
It's a really hard question because it depends what you want. So some people think Illinois is a disaster because we invest more than many states do in informal care. So we fund informal providers in the United States. I actually don't think personally that that's a bad thing given kind of what parents need in the current context. Massachusetts is always kind of pointed out as a leader because they have really strong regulations of their childcare sector, and they have higher quality care on average than other states, but they don't have the informal sector, as I understand it, as part of their childcare and early education system. And so my question to that is, who's in those settings, and are we capturing all the kind of precarious, non-standard, the children whose parents are working precarious and non-standard work in that kind of a state? But massive, you know, and then there's some on the public preschool question and the school-based care. Perhaps surprising, two southern states, Florida and Georgia and Oklahoma, historically have had really strong school-based full-time public preschool programs and really high-quality school-based care. And those are, you know, traditionally Republican states, red states with that have had bipartisan support for school-based intervention. So I think it really isn't as predictable as you might think. I will say that the southern states, even those two states besides school-based care, have much looser regulations on things like child provider ratio, et cetera. So that Massachusetts is often held up as having a very you know, tight ratio between the number of kids and provider. And so the quality of care is presumably better as a result than some of the southern states. But the school-based public preschool in Oklahoma and Georgia has been very highly rated and evaluated very positively.
Great. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. It was a great talk on a really important subject, and you're one of the experts because I see you quoted in so many of the citations there in your presentation. So we're really pleased that you were able to come tonight. And thanks for those online and for whoever it was that came in and told us there was a fire in Kennedytown this evening, and
no.
traffic was blocked coming up the road. So I think we probably had more people online as a result of the fire, and I hope everybody's okay. Yeah, I just have a few housekeeping items. I wanted to first let you all know that on Wednesday, the chief scientist at Argonne National Lab, Shirley Mung, will be here. She'll be doing a lunch talk, which is a different format for us. That's on Wednesday at 12 noon. I'm really excited to have her. She's a founding faculty director of the Energy Technology Initiative at UChicago. She's one of the leading authorities in energy storage materials in the world, and been wanting her to come here for quite some time to talk about some of the innovations in battery technology. So I hope you can join us for that. The other thing I'd like to mention, I referred to this the other night when we had our online program. We did close the applications for our high school summer academies this summer on April 30th. And I said to watch this space because we're evaluating applications and we might be opening it up again. Our climate sustainability summer academy is closed. However, watch for tomorrow if you have high school age students for the application period to open up again for a couple weeks through the end of the month. So I just wanted to make sure that you're aware of the Data Science Summer Academy and the Introduction to Public Policy Summer Academy. Looks like it'll be opening up for a couple weeks starting tomorrow. For those of you that are here in person, you have a brochure on your desk that you can use to refer to the QR code. And so that's all I wanted to say about Summer Academy. I always like to pitch our UChicago Hong Kong The Course podcast, where you can learn about our fabulous faculty at the University of Chicago. I think we have over 150 episodes now featuring so many faculty. And Julia, if you haven't been on, you'll be invited shortly so we can hear about your journey and how you became a professor at the University of Chicago. And that is a U Chicago Hong Kong campus production. So those are my housekeeping items for the night. Thanks for all of you who were able to get here tonight in person and hear this great talk, and hope to see you again soon, maybe on Wednesday.